you know, you're sitting there thinking, why we grow irrigated wheat? Why are we hearing about irrigated wheat? Cotton price is so high. You know, no one's interested in growing wheat under irrigation at the moment. And I guess if I can put a little bit of GRDC's thinking into it, we had a grain price spike a few years ago in 2008, you'll all remember, where the wheat was very favourable, particularly with the late water that arrived that season. They couldn't grow cotton because the water had arrived too late. And the wheat price was very high, $400 to $500 a tonne people were getting. And so irrigated wheat was the go. Now, are we going to see those situations again? Well, we can't gauge into the future and know for sure. But last year I was in China. I went to speak at a workshop, Australian researchers and Chinese researchers looking at a specific region in China, the North China Plain, where they have some incredible challenges for food production. This is an area, can't remember exactly, but I think roughly 2/3 the size of Victoria, where they produce food for about 600 million people. And this area in 20 years' time is going to be really struggling to produce the same amount of food then than it does now. They're mining their groundwater on this plain at a rate of 2 megalitres per hectare per year. They've got 5 aquifers. The top 3 aquifers are empty. They're in aquifer 4. It's 1,000-year-old water, doesn't recharge anytime soon. And so they're basically running right out of water. They pay their growers prices greater than our market prices, greater than international grain prices in real terms, to produce grain for their own people. They could buy grain cheaper on the world market than what they're actually doing, but they're paying their growers because they're so worried about their own food security. They are putting a price incentive to make sure they are producing 95% of their own food. And in 20 years' time, this water's going to be gone. 600 million people, and they're going to basically go back to rain-fed agriculture, where the productivity of the land is going to halve, basically. The groundwater mining allows them to grow a second crop in the year, basically. They grow wheat, maize, about 8 weeks of the year that the ground's not being sown to something. So I just want to put in your heads, this is why we're looking at things like irrigated wheat. So for the future, when we do get extreme fluctuations in prices, when it is favourable again for Australian growers to grow a grain crop under irrigation. Take-home messages from the talk today. We've looked at some varieties under different agronomy under irrigation. The take-home messages are, learning from 2008, learning from the trials last year. Varieties, quick varieties, particularly Crusader and Kennedy, are the best performed prime hard varieties under irrigation in terms of having less lodging susceptibility. But this is when we're controlling disease, okay? So this assumes that you're going to use a fungicide and control leaf disease. If you're not so hung up about growing prime hard, Morinda and Ruby did very well. They are with very low levels of lodging, and they yielded quite well across the sites that we harvested. Varieties do respond differently to agronomy. So when I talk to you today about some of the different agronomy, you've got to understand that if you take it back to your own farm, it might not work quite the same for you in your situation with your favourite variety. Okay, so we are getting data to say that different varieties need to be managed differently under irrigation. And the highlight of last year's activities was we were heavily involved in a case study at Brookstead, where we helped the growers sort of pick the appropriate management tools for their irrigated wheat, and we did achieve an 8 tonne to the hectare test strip of wheat at Brookstead last year. So all of this work is coming under the banner of the Achievable Yields for Irrigated Grains project. So this has been running for 4 years now. We had a 3-year project and we've had a 1-year extension for last season. One of the objectives of the project, how much can irrigated wheat and sorghum yield under irrigation? Because we're not entirely sure. Dryland irrigated wheat comps around the place have been won with yields as low as 5.5 tonne to the hectare. So what's actually can we achieve with irrigated wheat if we try hard? And the other objective of the project is just to look at improved agronomy. How can we grow our irrigated grain crops better so we can achieve high yields regularly? And so last year for this 1-year extension, hopefully as a feed into a new project, we basically went and ran some variety by agronomy trials where we looked at different varieties under different types of agronomy to start to get a feel for what sort of challenges we were going to have in that area. The trials were at Narrabri, Emerald and Gatton, and there's a picture of the on-farm monitoring where we went 8 tonne to the hectare as well. Just when I talk about lodging, lodging is obviously the big challenge for wheat, and I guess although you may not grow irrigated wheat, we have seen lodging in dryland crops in the last few years. If we continue to get wet seasons, we may see more lodging in dryland crops, so there's some relevance there to dryland growers who are growing in some of the more favourable areas. I just want to point out with lodging, when I'm doing a lodging score at the moment, you can get lodging developing late in the season, but you can also get it developing around flowering time or even before. And this is just a graph from Gatton a couple of years ago. But the point I want to make is, if you just did a lodging rating at harvest, these two varieties look identical. They were both very heavily lodged by harvest. Well, not two varieties, sorry, two agronomies for Gregory. But there's obviously a large difference here in how lodging progressed through the season. So in terms of harvest problems, yes, you've got the same. But in terms of how the variety filled its grains and how well it grew through grain filling, these two treatments were quite different. So I'm actually taking an average lodging score across grain filling. So you'll see me talk about a 40% lodging, and you need to understand that that's 40% lodging across grain filling. It could mean that it was still very heavily lodged at harvest, which is a problem in terms of getting the crop into the harvester, and I recognise that. But I just want you to get that in your head. This is average lodging across grain filling whenever you see a lodging score in this presentation. And by doing it that way, we can compare trials too for how severe the lodging was in a particular trial. Where we ran our trials last year, we had some various aims. The trials were fully irrigated, so we just kept it wet so that water was not a limiting factor in the production. We wanted to achieve, can I go backwards with this thing? We wanted to achieve 200 units of N in the crop by GS31, the end of tillering, when the crop's this high. And we did that in various different ways. And I'll talk about that in a second. Then we were putting 50 units of N on at flag leaf as well, just to make sure that the crop was fully happy with N. So ultimately we tried to get 250 units of N into that crop, whether it was stored soil N at the start of the season or applied N. We had some delayed N treatments where we only had the soil in at sowing, and that varied a little bit from site to site. And we applied most of the fertiliser at GS31. So we were actually putting on 150 units of urea sorry about that being a little low down there. In the delayed N treatment, we put 150 units of N on at GS31 and watered it in. So we just spread it by hand on our small plots and watered it in. Or we had upfront N where the urea N was applied at sowing and watered in as well. So all of the nitrogen was up front. What's GS31? Just to remind people, we used to work under an old Zadox system where we would feel for a hardened node, and some of you may still do that, okay? So this is the original Zadox method of growth stage rating, is when you feel for a hardened node. If you're growing canopy managed wheat, you need to understand there are different things out there now, and we're actually using something these days called the Totman index, which is a modified Zadox scale. You need to be aware of this, and we have to slice the stem open and actually physically look for the node starting to form, because if you feel for the hardened node, it's actually about 10 days later that you'll get GS31. And if you're using plant growth regulators or applying nitrogen, it's important to understand that 10 days can make a difference. So GS31 is when there's a 1 centimetre internode formed at the base of the plant, and once this next internode gets to 2 centimetres or more, that's called GS32. But it's often very late in this stage when you can actually really feel that node forming. So just understand there's different things going on. There's some trial results in your manual. I'm sorry I've gone over the top with that paper there, but when I produce something that's going to go on the internet, I like to make sure the bases are covered, because if you put variety results out there without explaining what you've done, companies who own those varieties might get a bit upset. So I've sort of tried to cover my bases and say this is how I've come to these conclusions. So there's some detailed stuff in the paper, but you'll probably find it a bit easier just to follow along with the presentation. Remember, this is preliminary data only, limited locations, single year of testing. We haven't come to really firm conclusions here, but this is in general where we're going with this variety testing. Across all of these sites, at Emerald we had a low and not high nitrogen site, but they didn't perform differently. So the statistics said basically you treat them all the same. And the winners were two varieties you've probably never heard of, two experimental varieties. We had some experimentals in there. And these two both come from Mexico, and they both, I mean, SB155 is an amazing variety because it not only does it yield really well, unless there's some rust in the trial which didn't get controlled properly, but it doesn't lodge. And so you can see that SB155 didn't lodge in any of the sites, and yet it was able to yield 9 tonne to the hectare. So we're currently talking to GRDC about starting a pre-breeding program with things like SB155 to improve the lodging resistance of our local germplasm. In terms of the best commercials, this is SB155 and CSIRO. I've just changed which lines are highlighted, so it's really easy to see what I'm talking about. Ruby and Marinda did quite well across all of these locations. Unfortunately, Narrabri didn't get harvested, and I'll talk about that later on. So that was really unfortunate because it's quite a different environment to these others. But Ruby and Marinda did very well, around the 7 tonne to the hectare mark, pushing 8 up at Emerald. They seem to really enjoy things up at Emerald for some reason. And again, very low levels of lodging in Ruby and Marinda. So naturally, they just seem to have something about them that gets them standing up tall. And Ruby was particularly amazing. We had a really poor seed lot, but I only ended up getting 25 plants per metre squared, and it still yielded 7 tonne to the hectare. So it just tilled and stood up, and it was really quite incredible. And other researchers around the world have found this under irrigated conditions. You can really recover from a very low seed rate. But here's Kennedy and Crusader. And so they both did very uniformly across these 4 trials. Under really high nitrogen at Gatton and under low nitrogen at Gatton, the Kennedy came close to having a significantly greater yield than the Crusader, but it wasn't quite there, so it's hard to say exactly whether it was or not. But what you'll notice is that the Kennedy had a much worse lodging problem when conditions got extremely favourable for lodging at the Gatton high nitrogen site and medium, whereas the Kennedy, did I say it right? The Crusader actually stood up very well, even under really high nitrogen, high lodging conditions. The rest. Ventura, not so crash hot. It was only yielding around the 6 tonne to the hectare mark. Got up, did it reasonably well under the high nitrogen at Gatton. Lang didn't do so well, and Gregory, we only managed to get into Gatton. When I plant a long season variety like Gregory, it's really got to be sown at a different date and flower on the same date as the others for it to be a fair comparison. If they're not flowering roughly at the same time, it's no longer a fair comparison between varieties because the conditions at flowering are very, very important for yield and also for lodging. So this particular trial, we designed it especially, we had extra planting dates and stuff. And the Gregory, we only managed to get it in on these 2 sites, but it's a very lodging susceptible variety wherever I've seen it. Brilliant variety under dryland conditions. Don't stop growing it. In your dryland conditions, it's your favourite. But if you're trying to get 7, 8 tonne of yield under irrigation, you want to stay away from some of these long season varieties. They are, most of them, very lodging susceptible. So you can see here, Gregory lodged badly in the 2 sites we had. And by the end of the trial, it was really tangled, flat mass on the ground. Ventura really didn't do so well. Lang was a bit intermediate, but ultimately these 3 didn't yield particularly well, let alone didn't do well with the lodging. So if you're an irrigated grower sitting in the room, you might sort of think to yourself, beauty, I'm going to jam the nitrogen in at the start of the season and grow Crusader. Irrigate it, no more problems. Who's rushing out to do that? No one's going to put up your hand because you know it's a trick question. And you have to spray it with fungicide too. We've had the protein results come back just from 1 pair of sites. So this, I've called this delayed and up front, but this is actually the low and the medium Gatton sites. Okay, so when we had very low levels of soil nitrogen at sowing and applied the nitrogen at GS31 mainly, Crusader only just managed to get prime hard, and Kennedy did significantly better in terms of its protein recovery from exactly the same nitrogen regime. Jam it all up front, 250 units of nitrogen by 200 units of N by GS31, 50 at flag leaf, Crusader still couldn't achieve prime hard. And we think we've got some understanding of why that might be happening in terms of Crusader's smaller grains and how fast it has to fill at grains, but we need to do a lot more work to confirm it. So this is where we've got to start realising that different varieties do grow differently. And at the moment, the difference between prime hard and your other grades of wheat price. Really important to get a handle on this, because if you're going to grow an irrigated wheat crop, you want to try and get that prime hard classification. So, how am I going, Pete? Got another few minutes yet?
Yeah, you got still a bit.
All right. So, yes, Crusader might be the way to go in terms of less lodging, and but 1 year of testing, limited sites. Hopefully, we're going to get some money and keep this work going over the next few years to really nail down some answers with this. Now, at Narrabri, which was a sad story, we didn't actually get any lodging there until right just at harvest. The trial was 2 days from being harvested. It hadn't lodged at all, so it was just going to be a yield trial. And then the big rain event came in, and we absolutely got soaked. We got flooded, barely stopped raining for the next 4 weeks, sprouted, didn't end up harvesting the trial. But we did get some lodging, so that was the bonus from the rain. But it was a different kind of lodging. It was very late season lodging, so it came just at harvest time, which is important to understand. Now, we had 2 treatments at Narrabri. It was a little bit different, where we had an early N application to try and have a higher lodging susceptibility. We also had a treatment where we delayed our N application and used plant growth regulators to basically give us a little bit of lodging resistance and see whether the varieties performed differently. And what we found was, in general, the bread wheat varieties all sort of had a slight improvement to their lodging resistance from this, which we call canopy management, which we expected. That's what we expected to see. But what was really interesting and maybe a little bit scary was the 2 durums in this trial. And so this is where, I say, don't rush out and plant 1,000 hectares of something based on what I've said. Have a think, have a play with it when you take it home and try it out for yourself. Because Caproy and Belleroy were sort of middle ranking in terms of their lodging resistance, just in the standard high-end, early, try and make it lodge part of the trial. But when we actually applied canopy management principles, they actually had the opposite trend to all the bread wheats. They got worse. They lodged worse when we applied some agronomy to try and make them lodge less. We didn't harvest the trial. We don't know what they yielded. It could be as simple as they responded so well to the canopy management that they were going to yield absolutely gangbusters. They might have broken world yield records for all I know. I don't know. And because of that extra yield potential at the top of the plant, then they went down. We don't know. So again, more work really needs to be done to sort of see whether canopy management needs to be applied differently to bread wheats than it does to durums. Just something else interesting in terms of how varieties respond. We looked at the height of the varieties and how they responded to that canopy management. If you can reduce the height from your management, you can reduce your lodging risk, because the taller lever goes over easier. So if you can reduce your plant height, that's what PGRs do. They reduce plant height. Delayed nitrogen application does that a little bit too. They should do if you use them right, hopefully. But some varieties aren't responding the same as others. So the taller varieties, so this is the natural height of the variety in the untreated plots, right? The taller varieties showed the biggest response to the plant growth regulators and the canopy management. Okay, so the taller varieties in general had a bigger height drop, whereas some of these short varieties showed no response at all. Some of these things are only 70 centimetres tall. So there's a little bit of an understanding there. Perhaps this is why we see variable response to plant growth regulators sometimes, depending on the variety you choose. There's genetics in that variety that are making it naturally shorter, and they're just not going to respond to a plant growth regulator.
How do you think you'd go putting it on a longer season variety like the Gregory? Do you think it'd bring it back into the field again, or is it still not worth considering?
Does it bring it back into the field? On Gregory, no. Gregory's too far gone. So PGRs, I don't see PGRs as a cure-all for any really lodging susceptible variety. I've only worked with them a little bit, and again, that's something we hope to look at more over the next few years. But they're part of a package. So if you can delay your nitrogen application, if you can use an appropriate low seeding rate, add plant growth regulators into that mix, they all add up a little bit to a more lodging resistant situation. Am I getting right? So Crusader and Kennedy were reasonably well performed varieties in the APH classification. Crusader had less lodging, but struggled a bit more with the protein, so may need more nitrogen added at flag leaf to really, hit prime hard. And again, I'll emphasise again, these varieties do respond differently to management, so we have to be careful when we take it back to a farm because we can't run trials at everybody's place. I just wanted to take you through this last little bit of, there was a federally funded DAF, Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries trial at Gatton. It was a heat stress trial. They were flying helicopters over it and using infrared cameras. But it was dry land, but it lodged. And they had 3 sowing dates, lots of varieties in it. So we thought, you beauty, let's go and get some data out of this trial. Useful starting point, very low replication in the trials. Yeah, don't take an awful lot out of this, but this is a useful starting point if you've got some other varieties that you want to know about. I've got a very detailed table in the book which shows the performance across 3 sowing dates. I've just summarised that for you, and I've got a few picks. But some of these varieties you won't have heard of so much, but your Axe and Derrimut, Sparta, Gladius had no lodging at any of the 3 sowing dates on a very lodging susceptible paddock. So very interesting things to look at for the future. Ellison interests me quite because it's a longer season, slightly longer season type, so I'm keen to sort of see it again under high nitrogen lodging susceptible. Livingston did well. All of these ones did better than Crusader. So sort of going down, you get slightly more lodging susceptible. And so Kennedy, which I'm sort of giving a bit of a plug to, is actually only in the middle of the middle group. So there's potentially a few other options out here that could do better. And this is again why we'd like to do some more testing. And here are some of your sad, highly lodged varieties. Even Hartog, which is a quick, and as a general rule, you would say the quicker maturing varieties are going to be less lodging susceptible. Hartog struggled. But here's some photos. I don't know how well they come up on the screen. Probably not real well. Baxter, Gregory, going over pretty flat. Burke, Sunco. I'd like to show you these photos so you get it in your head. If you're going to try and go and grow a 7-tonne crop, some of these varieties, you know, you might be taking your life in your hands. And here's a nice comparison. Sunvale, sorry, you can't see that. Sunvale right next to Kennedy. Kennedy standing up very nicely. This is our 8-tonne paddock. Hamish and Fraser Bly in their paddock. We got a story in the Grains Outlook, which was nice. Thank you very much, Neil Lyon, who I saw in the room earlier. He might have disappeared. I think he's disappeared. It was only a small paddock, 4 paddock histories, heavy black vert soil, high in N, but the N varied because they had 4 paddock histories. It was hard to know exactly how much N was there. He had Crusader and Kennedy in the paddock. They sowed it a sensible dryland plant pot. That's all you need for irrigation. The test strip yield, they just touched 8 tonne to the hectare in the Crusader. We think that's the first time it's verified 8 tonne in Queensland in a weigh bin. I've actually seen 9 to 10 tonne on yield monitors. Never sure how well the yield monitors are calibrated. So this one was actually calibrated, I'm told, but I'm still going to take it with a grain of salt, that particular paddock. But we've touched 8 tonne with a weigh bin. Kennedy didn't do quite as well in the weigh bin, but when the paddock yields came in, they both ended up being exactly the same. Moisture was a touch lower in the Crusader, so the actual yield might have been a touch higher, but protein was a touch higher in the Kennedy. Strategies they had to use: you've got to hold your crop back during tillering. If you're growing a high-yielding wheat crop under irrigation, you've got to hold it back early. That thick, lush canopy at GS31, that's what increases lodging susceptibility. Hold it back early, ramp it up during stem elongation, get your N on at the start of stem elongation, fungicides, plant growth regulators, and then flag leaf to mid-grain fill. The other thing that growers really don't understand is just how much water a wheat crop needs if you want it to yield really well. You know, last year we were lucky we had a lot of wet weather through that period, so they didn't actually probably only put 130 mil of irrigation on through that period. But really, wheat water use is running at about 40 to 50 mil a week in, you know, pretty standard spring conditions. So once you get to flag leaf, you've really got to keep the water on it, and then ease off during grain fill. Late grain fill, once, you know, the wetter the soil, the more likely it is to lodge. So once you get halfway through grain fill, you've really got to start shutting the irrigation down, letting the crop grow on stored water, so that you've got some firm ground for harvest as well.
Thanks, Allan.
So,
any comments on screenings and falling numbers? We threw Kennedy out in dryland terms at our area because it failed falling numbers before we had rain.
Yep. Didn't see too much black point in our trials. As far as screenings, under irrigation, we're really not getting any higher than 2 or 3%. So I don't think that's a big issue for you guys at those levels, is that right? Or is that 3% starting to make you nervous? Or so yeah, we really didn't see a lot.
Allan, What was your target population for any trials?
Target population is 100 plants per metre squared. And there's something very important to remember with that. Back in 2008, one of the mistakes that was made was you got your planting contractors running into furrow irrigated fields where you've got a 1 metre bed and you're only sowing 50 centimetres of wheat and then you've got 50 centimetres of bare furrow. And we're forgetting, some of them, to reduce our plant rate. Okay, you only want 100 plants per metre squared on that bed area. And so the comparable dryland paddock next door to that 50 centimetre, 1 metre bed furrow paddock would actually get twice as much seed used to plant it. A very important point, because increasing your plant pop to 200 plants per metre squared drastically increases your lodging risk. But obviously, in terms of establishing it into a furrow paddock where maybe you haven't worked the ground particularly well, then it's trickier to get the right plant pop. But 100 plants is all we really need, and as I said, 25 plants a metre can recover very well.
And were you seeing, after irrigations, were you seeing greater incidence of lodging coming straight after irrigation events?
Yep. There's two types of lodging: stem lodging, root lodging. The stem will buckle in stem lodging, the roots will dislodge in root lodging. So yeah, in an irrigation event, particularly flood irrigation or black soil, it just turns to soup. So the plant really doesn't have much holding it up. So again, this is why late in grain filling, when the crop's getting most susceptible to lodging, you've really got to ease off on the irrigation. The timing of that last irrigation is still a bit of an unknown, I think, in terms of, and going to vary with soil type. How much water is in that soil, where is it, when do you put that last irrigation on to make sure you're not going to end up with some small grains at the end, get your high yield, but you don't want to have a lodging problem happening on that last irrigation. So we need to do more work on that.
Do you think you could offset that by going for narrow row spacing than 50 centimetres? I think it's pretty wide.
Row spacing's an interesting one. I would 8, 10, 12 inches, fine as far as I'm concerned for irrigated wheat. If you wanted to go to really narrow row spacing, you've really got to start to use some other strategies like the delayed end to hold that crop back, because the more you pack the plants in, again, you're going to potentially end up with a lodging problem.